What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
The air in our cozy living room hung thick with the comforting aroma of roasted turkey mingled with the sharp tang of cranberry sauce and the underlying tension of unspoken family resentments that had simmered for years beneath the surface of our annual holiday gatherings, where the twinkling lights strung across the Christmas tree cast flickering shadows over the faces of my brothers Mark and Tom, their wives exchanging subtle glances of solidarity, my parents seated at the head of the long oak table that had witnessed countless dinners filled with laughter and arguments alike, and all of us pausing mid-bite as Dad cleared his throat with that gravelly rumble honed from decades of factory work and late-night debates over the dinner table, his eyes locking onto mine before he delivered the words that shattered the fragile piece like a dropped ornament on the hardwood floor. "You're out of the will, Lacy," he announced without preamble or apology, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal certainty that my brothers needed the inheritance far more than I ever would, since they had families to support and businesses teetering on the edge of failure, while I had always been the self-sufficient daughter who left home for the city lights without looking back or asking for a dime, a declaration that hung in the suddenly still room amid the clatter of silverware settling against china plates loaded with mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and slices of pie waiting to be served, prompting Mark to lean back in his chair with his belly straining against the festive pattern of his holiday sweater, a smug nod crossing his face as if this moment validated all the years he dismissed my career choices as frivolous pursuits compared to his own string of half-baked ventures. Tom fidgeted with the edge of his napkin, his fingers twisting the fabric nervously while he mentally tallied how much of Dad's modest estate might finally bail him out of the latest get-rich-quick scheme that had left him with maxed-out credit cards and a garage full of unsold inventory, their wives offering supportive murmurs that underscored the familial narrative of the burdened sons versus the unattached sister who had somehow thrived without the safety net of home, and Mom attempted to defuse the bomb with a forced laugh while passing the gravy boat around the table as if the rich brown liquid could somehow mend the rift Dad had just carved into our already frayed bonds, but the silence that followed stretched taut like an overstrung holiday light ready to snap, enveloping us all until my nephew Jake, just 16 and perpetually glued to his smartphone as if it held the secrets to the universe rather than just memes and social feeds, glanced up from the glow of his screen with wide-eyed confusion that bridged the gap between youthful innocence and accidental revelation. "Aunt Lacy's a billionaire," he blurted out innocently, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the room's sudden attention as he held up the device to show a headline from some obscure tech blog that I'd assumed would remain buried in the digital ether far from the prying eyes of my small-town family. The article detailing how my anonymously developed app for remote work scheduling had exploded in value during the pandemic shutdowns of 2020, transforming quiet lines of code into a fortune that placed me among the silent elite without fanfare or family fanfare. The entire table plunged into a profound hush, forks clattering forgotten against plates and eyes swiveling toward me in unison, as if I had sprouted wings or horns right there amid the festive napkins and candlelight, the gears in their minds grinding audibly as they processed how the quiet middle child who had packed her bags after high school and rarely returned for more than a weekend had amassed wealth on a scale that dwarfed Dad's entire life savings, Mark choking on a sip of spiked eggnog that sent him sputtering questions about stock options and venture capital deals he barely comprehended, while Tom leaned forward with that familiar wheeler-dealer gleam in his eye, already scheming ways to weave himself into the narrative of my unexpected success as a means to alleviate his own financial woes. Dad simply stared at me across the table, his face paling beneath the ruddy flush of holiday cheer and perhaps a dawning realization that his calculated snub had ignited a firestorm he hadn't anticipated, the kind where blood ties clashed against the cold reality of hidden empires built in solitude. And though a surge of indignation rose in my chest urging me to hurl my wine glass against the wall or unleash a torrent of words about the years of overlooked potential and gendered expectations that had driven me to forge my path alone, I chose instead to maintain that tight-lipped smile I'd cultivated over countless family slights, letting the moment marinate in their discomfort as the questions began to pile up like unopened gifts stacking beneath the tree. It was nothing dramatic at first, just a casual swirl of my wine glass as I met their stares with feigned nonchalance, but sensing the opportunity to plant the first seed of unease in this unfolding drama, I decided to offer a subtle nudge toward the truths they weren't ready to face, mentioning offhand that they might want to take a closer look at that old family cabin up in the Wisconsin woods, which Dad had always referred to as untouchable Harlan property passed down through generations. Because unbeknownst to them, I'd been quietly covering the property taxes and maintenance fees for over a decade now without a single thank you or inquiry. A revelation that dropped their jaws in perfect synchronization as Mark muttered frantic questions about legal deeds and property records, while Tom whipped out his own phone to begin a frantic search right there at the table. Excusing myself to the kitchen under the pretense of fetching more pumpkin pie, I left them to stew in the thickening fog of uncertainty, my heart racing with the exhilarating tang of that initial revenge served cold and calculated, pondering just how far their greed and surprise would propel this holiday fiasco before I unveiled more layers of the life I'd built far from their judgmental shadows. Navigating the snow-dusted backroads of our sleepy Ohio hometown under the pale glow of street lamps that Christmas night, with the radio droning familiar carols that now carried an ironic bite to their lyrics about joy and reconciliation amid family strife, I replayed the explosive dinner scene in my mind over and over, chuckling softly to myself at the sheer absurdity of how Dad's authoritative disinheritance had unraveled so spectacularly thanks to Jake's wide-eyed revelation pulled straight from the depths of the internet, where I'd hoped my professional life could remain concealed from the very people who'd always viewed my ambitions as little more than pipe dreams compared to the practical paths my brothers had stumbled along. Pulling over at a deserted intersection to catch my breath and wipe away the mix of mirthful tears and lingering bitterness that blurred my vision on the windshield, I allowed the memories to flood back unbidden to those formative years in my early 20s. When I'd graduated from community college with a business degree that Dad dismissed as useless fluff since it lacked the prestige of the engineering programs he'd pushed on Mark and Tom, forcing me to hustle through double shifts waitressing at greasy spoon diners where the air smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon, pocketing meager tips from weary truckers who shared tales of the open road, while I dreamed of something bigger than scraping by in the shadow of our families' modest expectations. Every spare cent from those exhausting days went toward saving for a second-hand laptop that became my lifeline in the quiet hours after midnight, where I'd teach myself basic coding through free online tutorials and late-night library sessions, piecing together an rudimentary app designed to streamline remote job scheduling for freelancers scattered across the country, a project born from my own frustrations with unreliable gig work that no one in my family took seriously when I mentioned it during obligatory holiday calls, viewing it as just another of my fleeting hobbies destined to fizzle out like the craft store ventures Tom had abandoned after a few months of false starts. The real breakthrough came unexpectedly during the global shutdowns of 2020, when isolation and economic panic turned my humble tool into an essential lifeline for millions confined to home offices and makeshift desks, the downloads surging overnight as companies scrambled for ways to keep operations afloat without physical presence, quietly multiplying my equity shares into a fortune that I funneled through anonymous offshore accounts and shell companies to avoid the very scrutiny that now threatened to expose it all following Jake's innocent slip at the dinner table. My smartphone began vibrating incessantly against the dashboard as I resumed driving toward the city outskirts, where my unassuming condo masked a life of calculated discretion, the first barrage coming from Mom, in a string of voice messages laced with her signature blend of worry and passive pleas for me to return to the house immediately so we could hash out the misunderstanding over slices of leftover ham and cups of herbal tea, her tone implying that family bonds should override any hurt feelings stirred by Dad's blunt announcement. But interspersed among her appeals were calls from Mark that escalated from curious inquiries to outright demands for clarification on this so-called billionaire status, his voicemails ranting about the sacred principle of sharing successes within the bloodline, and how I had no right to hoard windfalls when his own family grappled with mounting mortgage payments and the endless costs of orthodontics for his teenage kids. I let most of them roll to voicemail, steeling myself against the pull of old loyalties that had kept me sending discreet checks to cover emergencies over the years. But Tom's incoming call pierced through my resolve just as the highway lights blurred into the urban sprawl, his voice cracking with a mix of feigned brotherly concern and barely veiled desperation as he confessed over the line that his most recent foray into cryptocurrency trading had imploded spectacularly, leaving him buried under a pile of debts that threatened to drag his entire household into foreclosure unless a timely intervention could steady the ship. Though a flicker of compassion stirred within me recalling the anonymous wire transfer I'd made to his account just last spring to quietly settle his daughter's tuition without drawing attention or gratitude, I opted this time for a more measured response that skirted direct aid, offering instead some generic counsel about diversifying into safer harbors like broad market index funds rather than chasing the volatile highs of digital coins that evaporated faster than morning mist, a suggestion he met with mounting frustration as he accused me of abandoning familial duty in the wake of Dad's will. Revelation, pressing harder for a concrete loan that would bridge his gap without the strings of repayment plans or interest rates. The conversation ended abruptly with me disconnecting amid his protests, a light laugh escaping my lips at the irony of how my hard-won success stemmed partly from bailing out the same kin who now positioned themselves as victims deserving of my largesse. And as I pulled into the driveway of my secluded property with its panoramic view of the glittering skyline that symbolized my hidden triumphs, another message lit up the screen from Jake of all people, this one attaching a grainy photograph, snapped hastily from Grandma's dusty attic amid the holiday decorations, depicting an aged family Bible opened to a yellowed page inscribed with cryptic notes about a long-forgotten trust fund that bore my name in her looping handwriting alongside references to seed money for independent pursuits. My pulse quickened as I enlarged the image under the porch light, the implications dawning that this overlooked relic might connect directly to the early investments I dismissed as mere luck, potentially unraveling threads of family history I'd long assumed irrelevant. But before I could fire off a reply seeking more context, the crunch of tires on gravel announced Mark's uninvited arrival, his SUV idling aggressively in the drive as he emerged with purpose, demanding through the intercom that we settle this face-to-face without further games. Ushering him inside with a pot of fresh coffee to temper the confrontation, I listened patiently to his barrage about equity and how Dad's decision was merely tough love meant to foster unity, all while subtly steering the dialogue toward his own shadowy side gig peddling imported gadgets through back-channel online marketplaces that flirted dangerously with customs regulations he'd once boasted about evading during a boozy barbecue. His bluster faltered noticeably when I casually referenced a creditor's notice I'd taken the liberty of forwarding anonymously that afternoon through a simple online tip line, nothing traceable back to me but sufficient to rattle his suppliers and introduce a ripple of doubt into his fragile operations, prompting him to backpedal with hasty assurances of speaking to Dad on my behalf and retreating to his vehicle with tail between his legs. Locking the door behind his departure, I savored the sharp satisfaction of that understated retaliation echoing through the quiet house, yet Jake's photographic clue persisted on my screen like a siren's call, beckoning me to delve deeper into the archives of our shared past before the next wave of intrusions could crest. Stirring awake the morning after Mark's abrupt departure to the insistent chirp of my alarm blended with the distant hum of city traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo that overlooked the sprawling Ohio skyline where I'd carved out my independent existence far removed from the small-town rhythms that had once defined our family's daily lives, I faced an inbox swollen with a deluge of messages from distant relatives and cousins I hadn't exchanged more than birthday cards within over a decade, each one laced with thinly veiled curiosity about the billionaire bombshell Jake had unwittingly detonated at the dinner table and probing questions about whether any of my newfound prosperity might extend to the broader Harlan clan through scholarships for grandkids or loans for aging vehicles on the brink of breakdown. Brewing a robust pot of coffee that filled the kitchen with its rich, grounding aroma to steady my nerves against the onslaught of digital intrusions, I scrolled through the barrage while fragments of my past resurfaced uninvited, pulling me back to the relentless grind of the pandemic era when the world ground to a halt and my scheduling app evolved from a niche tool for gig workers into a comprehensive platform that integrated AI-driven matching for remote teams. Those sleepless months spent refining algorithms in isolation as infection rates climbed and economies teetered, transforming my solitary coding sessions into a revenue engine that quietly accrued billions through strategic partnerships with Fortune 500 companies desperate for continuity amid chaos. The family group chat ignited into a frenzy by midday, dominated by Mom's earnest entreaties for a mediated sit-down at the local community center to dissect the raw edges of Dad's announcement and restore some semblance of holiday harmony. Her words painting a picture of fractured unity that tugged at the remnants of my loyalty despite the fresh wounds, and although the temptation to ignore the summons and bury myself in work emails proved strong, the nagging intrigue surrounding Jake's attic discovery compelled me to agree. Arriving at the nondescript venue amid rows of metal folding chairs arranged in a loose circle around a sputtering coffee urn that did little to warm the chilly atmosphere thick with anticipation and undercurrents of resentment. Dad cornered me almost immediately upon entry, drawing me into a dimly lit alcove away from the milling crowd where his hands trembled slightly as he confessed the estate's fragility under the strain of mounting medical bills from Mom's recent cancer treatments that had depleted savings faster than anticipated, framing the will's favoritism toward Mark and Tom as a necessary safeguard for the lineage's future rather than a personal slight against my achievements, yet his evasive glances and clipped responses hinted at layers beneath the surface that aligned suspiciously with the cryptic trust notations in Grandma's Bible, stirring my skepticism about the full scope of his financial narrative. Mark barreled into the conversation next with his characteristic bluster, brandishing crumpled printouts from dubious online sources that inflated estimates of my net worth into absurd figures and insisting I validate the claims on the spot to dispel what he called malicious rumors. His demands echoing the entitlement that had always colored our sibling dynamic where his ventures received endless second chances while mine were met with skepticism, and Tom followed suit by adopting a more theatrical sympathy, his eyes welling with manufactured tears as he recounted the toll of his wife's anxiety over unpaid utility bills and the looming shadow of credit collectors. A performance designed to evoke the compassion I'd shown anonymously in the past by covering such crises from afar without seeking acknowledgement or reciprocity, opting to withhold the concrete proofs of my wealth that could have quelled their frenzy in an instant. I delivered a measured overview of the app's trajectory from humble beginnings to pandemic powerhouse, sharing just enough technical jargon to intimidate without specifics on balances or assets. A choice that undoubtedly cast me as the unyielding holdout in the eyes of those yearning for swift resolution and familial generosity, prioritizing the hard lesson of self-reliance over the easier balm of disclosure even as it deepened the chasm of misunderstanding. Around the table, as accusations ricocheted through the room like errant ping-pong balls, branding me with labels of selfishness and detachment that stung more than I'd admit, I diffused the mounting hostility with a disarming chuckle and a timely pivot, extracting my phone to proffer what I presented as insider wisdom on a burgeoning energy sector stock poised for exponential growth through green initiatives, extolling its virtues as a foolproof diversification strategy far superior to the speculative gambles that had plagued Mark's portfolio for years, watching with concealed amusement as he seized the ticker symbol and relayed it urgently to his broker via text right there amid the folding chairs. Mere minutes later, as the group teetered on the edge of outright confrontation, Mark's device erupted with notifications heralding a sudden market plunge triggered by an untimely regulatory probe I'd subtly anticipated and timed through a trusted contact's whisper network, the stock's value cratering in a comedic nosedive that left him red-faced and sputtering excuses, while involuntary laughter rippled through the assembly at his misfortune, transforming the tension into a momentary release. That underscored the perils of unchecked avarice without directly implicating my orchestration. The impromptu gathering dissolved into awkward embraces and half-hearted promises of future dialogues as attendees filtered toward the parking lot under a slate-gray sky threatening snow, but Jake lingered behind with a conspiratorial whisper that reignited the intrigue. confiding that his continued rummaging through digitized family records had unearthed my name attached to substantial anonymous donations for regional hospitals over the past 5 years. Contributions large enough to potentially eclipse Dad's claims of penury and rewrite the entire inheritance equation if exposed to the light of day, his revelation hanging in the air like an unexploded ordnance as I navigated the lot toward my car, bracing for the inevitable escalation of whatever intervention the family might muster next in their quest to unravel my guarded world. Sifting through the ever-expanding web of digital breadcrumbs that Jake had begun unearthing with the fervor of a young detective piecing together a puzzle far beyond his years. From hastily scanned fragments of Grandma's will tucked away in forgotten family albums to speculative forum threads buzzing with guesses about reclusive tech moguls who operated in the shadows of Silicon Valley's glare, I sensed the encroaching pressure of my family's relentless pursuit closing in like fog rolling off Lake Erie on a humid summer morning, particularly as Tom materialized unannounced at the lobby of my downtown office building under the guise of a serendipitous coffee run that fooled no one given the awkward stiffness in his posture and the way his eyes started toward the directory listing my company name among the high-rise tenants. Those foundational days of my entrepreneurial journey blurred into a montage of grit and isolation in my recollections now, encompassing the whirlwind of venture capital pitches conducted from the confines of a cramped studio apartment where rejection emails piled up alongside takeout containers. A phase where I decisively rebuffed Dad's conditional offer to co-sign a modest business loan because it came bundled with ultimatums about abandoning the chaotic city for the stability of home and a 9-to-5 job that aligned with his vision of security. An independence that armored me against later appeals even as it widened the emotional gulf separating me from the siblings who'd leaned on such safety nets without question. My app's meteoric ascent during the economic rebound of 2021 had hinged on that very autonomy, pivoting the platform toward sophisticated AI algorithms that matched freelancers with corporate needs across continents, generating revenue streams that snowballed into billions shielded behind layers of legal entities and privacy protocols designed to deflect exactly the kind of scrutiny now bearing down in the aftermath of Jake's dinner table disclosure, turning what had been a sanctuary of solitude into a battleground where every notification carried the potential for exposure. Tom's persistence chipped away at those defenses during our strained latte-fueled exchange in the bustling cafe downstairs, his confessions spilling out in halting admissions of a crippling gambling habit that had spiraled from casual poker nights into online wagers, devouring his savings and threatening the roof over his family's head. A vulnerability I'd inadvertently enabled 2 years prior by routing an anonymous $5,000 transfer to avert repossession of his vehicle after one particularly devastating losing streak, an act of quiet benevolence that now fueled my internal turmoil as I grappled with the dilemma of whether to illuminate his dependencies or let the cycle perpetuate under the weight of Dad's favoritism. The ethical quandary gnawed at me through the ensuing commutes home along rain-slicked boulevards, balancing the impulse to safeguard his children from fallout against the strategic value of leveraging this knowledge to recalibrate the family power dynamics skewed by years of overlooked contributions on my part, ultimately culminating in my controversial stipulation that any assistance would require him to pledge equity in his home as collateral, a pragmatic yet callous bargain that sent him retreating in a huff and strained the fragile rapport I'd maintained with his sympathetic teenage daughter who viewed me as the cool aunt untainted by the household dramas. Meanwhile, Mark's amateur online investigations yielded partial successes in the form of unearthed patent documents where my contributions lurked in fine print among collaborative credits, igniting speculative chatter in the family messaging threads where aunts and uncles wove narratives of me exerting undue influence to manipulate the will's terms, recasting my self-made narrative into a tale of shadowy machinations that positioned me as the antagonist in their collective story of entitlement and betrayal, a portrayal I exacerbated playfully by liking the most outlandish posts just to fan the flames of their paranoia without deigning to correct the record. The pivotal twist emerged via Jake's latest encrypted email attachment, comprising redacted transaction records from one of my charitable foundations that traced direct payoffs to Tom's mounting debts over the past 3 years. Irrefutable evidence that I'd functioned as their clandestine benefactor long before the inheritance uproar, a revelation potent enough to dismantle alliances and rewrite loyalties if aired publicly, forcing me to contemplate the moral cost of weaponizing such intimacy against the brother who'd always treated me like an afterthought. As the week wore on with Dad issuing a terse summons for an emergency while reading at the family lawyer's office under the pretext of injecting finality into the lingering ambiguities, I fortified my position by cobbling together a rudimentary script on my laptop, far from sophisticated cyber mischief, but cleverly tailored to intercept and reroute Mark's outgoing emails through a mirrored server that appended auto-generated confessions of his embellished job search tales to the group chain, such as fabricated interview anecdotes with blue-chip firms or inflated reimbursements for lavish networking lunches disguised as essential business fare. The ensuing digital uproar unfolded in real-time notifications that painted him as the king of white lies, eliciting a torrent of embarrassed backpedals and reluctant chuckles from the recipients that diffused his aggression while underscoring the hollowness of his moral high ground. A satisfyingly ingenious reprisal that granted me a temporary reprieve from the siege and allowed a moment to breathe amid the escalating siege. Yet as I gathered my documents and headed toward the appointed meeting with Jake's damning files tucked securely in my briefcase, the atmosphere thickened palpably with intimations of Dad's concealed motives poised to surface and potentially upend the fragile equilibrium we'd all been navigating so precariously. Stepping into the dimly lit confines of the family lawyer's office on that crisp post-holiday afternoon, where the air carried the musty undertones of aged legal tomes stacked on oak shelves alongside the faint bitterness of machine-brewed coffee that did little to mask the collective anxiety radiating from the assembled Harlans squeezed into mismatched vinyl chairs arranged in a semicircle around a polished conference table scarred by years of contentious meetings, I took stock of the scene. With Dad positioned rigidly at the forefront beside his bespectacled attorney whose clipboard clutched the documents that promised either closure or catastrophe in this protracted saga sparked by his ill-fated Christmas declaration, while Mark slouched defensively with residual embarrassment from the email debacle still etching furrows in his brow, and Tom fidgeted restlessly, his gaze flicking toward his phone in hopes of a last-minute reprieve from the collateral demands I'd imposed during our tense cafe confrontation. The proceedings commenced with a monotonous recitation of standard clauses delineating the modest allocation of the family home, a few thousand in savings accounts depleted by unforeseen medical expenses, and sundry personal effects passed down through generations that held more sentimental than monetary value, each detail unfolding like the slow unraveling of a frayed holiday ribbon that barely concealed the underlying knots of discord. And as the lawyer's voice droned on toward the contentious disinheritance provision favoring my brothers as stewards of the Harlan legacy burdened with dependents and faltering enterprises, a profound stillness descended upon the room heavier than the snow blanketing the streets outside, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers or suppressed cough that amplified the electric undercurrent of anticipation swirling among us all. Dad's pre-meeting voicemail replayed in my thoughts, his gravelly timbre laced with uncharacteristic vulnerability as he alluded to rectifying the imbalances born from desperation in the wake of Mom's health crisis, yet the codicil that followed the lawyer's careful enunciation introduced a seismic twist, disclosing the will's structure not as arbitrary favoritism, but as an elaborate test of character engineered with consultations from Grandma's erstwhile financial advisor, who had long ago confided in me about the intricacies of her Bible-noted trust, a mechanism designed to gauge whether material incentives could forge unity from division or merely exacerbate the greed that had plagued our bloodline for decades. Reflections cascaded through my mind back to the crucible choices that had forged my empire. From the solitary nights iterating code in my early apartment to the bold pivot during the 2020 recovery when infusing AI into the app's core propelled it to connect global workforces and amass billions in a fortress of fiscal independence that now served as both shield and sword against the familial incursions, and with Jake's meticulously compiled files resting in my lap, like loaded dice ready to roll, the interconnections crystallized in stark relief. From the anonymous infusions that had stabilized Tom's debts to the understated nudges bolstering Mark's ventures without fanfare, the tapestry of my covert support weaving through their lives in ways that rendered Dad's ploy both poignant and profoundly misguided. As the room ignited with a cacophony of protests from my brothers clamoring for revisions and audits, amid Mom's quiet sobs over the web of deceptions that had ensnared us all, the lawyer interjected with mention of a disputed asset in the form of our ancestral Wisconsin cabin, its title quietly transferred to me by Grandma as a testament to the resilience she'd admired in the daughter overlooked by traditional hierarchies, a revelation that drained the color from Dad's face and ignited a fresh barrage of accusations framing my silence as calculated sabotage rather than earned discretion. Choosing the path that inverted the dynamics with precision and a dash of ironic wit, I rose steadily to address the tumult. Unveiling a curated ledger from my tablet chronicling the tens of thousands dispersed through my foundations to underwrite their crises over the years, from tuition payments to emergency repairs, enough to eclipse the estate's value and underscore the fallacy of their victimhood, then halting dramatically to propose matching the inheritance's worth toward a genuine family trust fund contingent upon full transparency and mutual accountability. No more hidden debts or snide dismissals that had eroded our bonds long before the dinner table detonation. The air crackled with the gratifying deflation of Mark and Tom's postures as they nodded in reluctant concession, Jake's proud grin cutting through the haze like a beacon of unintended alliance. But as the session concluded and we spilled into the bracing winter air outside the building, Dad drew me aside in a shadowed alcove with a probing whisper that lingered like an unresolved chord in a symphony, questioning outright whether I'd engineered Jake's discoveries through some subtle back-channel influence or anonymous prompt that had set this unraveling in motion from the shadows, compelling me to respond with that same enigmatic smile I'd worn through the chaos without uttering a syllable of confirmation or denial as car doors thudded shut and headlights pierced the gathering dusk, leaving the veracity of my maneuvers and the ultimate toll on our fractured ties suspended in ambiguity that invited endless rumination on whether forgiveness could mend what fortunes both built and buried, or if the true inheritance lay in the lessons of self-forged paths amid the ruins of expectation.